Welcome again, everybody, to Hearers of the Word. For the Feast of the Assumption, I'm making a change of policy. Instead of commenting the Gospel, my intention is to comment the reading from the book of Revelation, a quite difficult reading, but one which I think is well worth exploring in its own right and for the meaning at the time of writing, which can certainly help us today. So I hope you find it useful. The Feast of the Assumption, and our reading is taken from the book of Revelation, chapter 12. For this presentation, we have a slightly unusual sequence. We'll begin as usual by reading the text, and then we'll take note of the biblical and Jewish background, the mythological background, and the political background, and then we'll change gear and do a story analysis in terms of myth and take note of the mythic reading, and finally we'll come to today. So the first step is to read this intriguing text as a whole, chapter 12, verses 1 to 18. Then a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and on her head was a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was screaming in labour pains, struggling to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, a huge red dragon that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 diadem crowns. Now the dragon's tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. So the woman gave birth to a son, a male child, who is going to rule over all the nations with an iron rod. Her child was suddenly caught up to God and to his throne, and she fled into the wilderness, where a place had been prepared for her by God, so that she could be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But the dragon was not strong enough to prevail, so there was no longer any place left in heaven for him and his angels. So that huge dragon, the ancient serpent, the one who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels along with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "The salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the ruling authority of his Christ have now come, because the accuser of our brothers and sisters, the one who accuses them day and night before our God, has been thrown down. But they have overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. Therefore, you heavens rejoice, and all who reside in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you. He is filled with terrible anger, for he knows that he only has a little time." Now when the dragon realized that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of a giant eagle, so that she could fly out into the wilderness to the place God had prepared for her, where she is taken care of, away from the presence of the serpent, for a time, times, and half a time. Then the serpent spouted water like a river out of his mouth after the woman in an attempt to sweep her away by a flood. But the earth came to her rescue. The ground opened up and swallowed the river that the dragon had spewed from his mouth. So the dragon became enraged at the woman and went away to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony about Jesus. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. The text I have just read is undoubtedly difficult, and a good deal of background needs to be filled in. As almost always in the New Testament Apocalypse, there is constant reference by allusion to parts of the Old Testament. And I won't read them all, but you can see on the slide here all the text to which it probably alludes. But a closer background can be found by looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and Greek and Roman mythology. Part of the background to Revelation chapter 12 lies in apocalyptic writings. And in the apocalyptic literary imagination, the idea of labour pains, childbirth and a new baby, all these are used as a kind of metaphor for the end of time, where there'll be a tremendous struggle, very painful, and then new life. And this could be illustrated from many texts, but here's one from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from 1Q Hymns, verse 11. I am in distress as a woman about to give birth to her firstborn. For her pangs come over her, and she has excruciating pain at the mouth of her womb, writhing in the womb of the pregnant one. For children come into life through the crashing waves of death. And she who is pregnant with a male child is afflicted by her birth pains. For through the crashing waves of death she delivers a male child. Through the pains of Sheol there bursts forth from the womb of the pregnant one a wonderful counsellor with his strength. A male child is delivered from the crashing waves. Into the one who is pregnant with him rush all the crashing waves and excruciating pains when they are born, and terror to their mothers. And when he is born, all pangs come suddenly to the womb of the pregnant one. But she that is pregnant with wickedness experiences excruciating pain and the crashing waves of the pit for all works of terror. And further on the text, it actually goes on to mention a serpent. So in this little hymn, there are three figures: the woman, the mother, the son who is evidently the Messiah, and the struggle with evil, represented later in the text as a serpent. And there's quite a strong emphasis on the terrible pains of the end of time and the multiplication of trials and tribulations. And towards the end, God is praised for his redemption. Now, all of this is a kind of reflection inspired by Genesis chapter 3 and the sign of the woman. And this is part of the general background to Revelation chapter 12, which does not come from nowhere, but from Jewish apocalyptic speculation. As indicated earlier, there is also a mythological background, and the characters here are Zeus, Leto, Apollo, and the dragon called Python. So on the right is a sort of summary of the legend. According to Hyginus, when Zeus lay with the goddess Leto, she became pregnant with Artemis and Apollo. Hera was jealous and sent Python to pursue Leto throughout the lands to prevent her from giving birth to the twin gods. Thus, when Apollo was born, he wanted to avenge his mother's plight and pursued Python, making his way straight for Mount Parnassus, where the serpent dwelled, and chased it to the oracle of Gaia at Delphi. And there he dared to penetrate the sacred precinct and kill it with his arrows beside the rock cleft where the priestess sat on her tripod. And this legend is a sort of an illustration of the cosmic conflict of good and evil. So really what you have is darkness versus light, night versus day, death versus life, sterility versus fertility, disorder versus order. And Apollo, of course, is the great god of order. This has been painted many times, and there's also an inscription actually at Patmos where there was a special reception of a version of this legend. So part of the cultural resonance of chapter 12 for the first hearers. there's more. The Roman emperors found the myth of Leto and Apollo and the python politically useful. Apollo was understood as the primeval king who had reigned over a golden age of peace and prosperity. Augustus, the first emperor, interpreted his own rule in terms of his tradition, claiming that his administration was the golden age, and casting himself in the role of the new Apollo. And later, Nero erected statues to himself as the god Apollo, and there were coins on which the radiance of the sun god emanates from the emperor's head. The illustration here is a coin of Augustus, and on the back of it is seated Apollo playing his harp. All of this, of course, was part of the political propaganda of the time. A grateful Roman citizen was encouraged to think of the myth as a reflection of his or her own experience with the following cast. The woman is the goddess Roma, the queen of heaven, to whom there were many temples across the empire. The son is the emperor Augustus, who kills the dragon and founds the new golden age. The dragon represents the power of darkness that opposes the goodness of life. And so the myth reflected political and social reality the emperors hoped at the time. I'm now going to shift analysis and begin to look at chapter 12 in terms of story. And here is my story analysis model. Classically, every story can be divided up in the following roles. There is an agent who is sending an object to a receiver. And somebody has to do this, that's the subject, and the subject experiences help and also experiences opposition. A very simple example in our culture would be Little Red Riding Hood. Her mother is sending a gift to the grandmother. Little Red Riding Hood is bringing the gift. She is opposed by the wolf, but she is helped by the woodsman. And that little model can be used for many classical stories and can help us to see the mini narratives in chapter 12. So we read the first story. Then a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and with the moon under her feet, and on her head was a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was screaming in labour pains, struggling to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, a huge red dragon that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 diadem crowns. Now the dragon's tail swept away a third of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. So the woman gave birth to a son, a male child, who is going to rule over all the nations with an iron rod. Her child was suddenly caught up to God and to his throne, and she fled into the wilderness, where a place had been prepared for her by God, so she could be taken care of for 1,260 days. The 7 heads and the 10 horns clearly represent Roman power, and the 1,260 days represents half of 7. So, in other words, an interim period under the control of God, even though it involves chaos and suffering. In terms of our story analysis, at the top line of the story, God is giving life to the child. The subject of the story is the woman who is giving birth. She is obviously opposed by the dragon, and in this case, miraculously helped by God. So this is one little mini unit of narrative. So now we read the second story. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But the dragon was not strong enough to prevail, so there was no longer any place left in heaven for him and his angels. So that huge dragon, the ancient serpent, the one who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels along with him. This primeval story of the fall of the angels is not found elsewhere in Scripture, but is here in the book of Revelation. There's no doubting the identity of the enemy. The verse 9 there has a very insistent and clear description. In terms of our story analysis, at the top line, God is bringing defeat to the dragon. The locus of this struggle is the cosmos, and God is, so to speak, helped by Michael and his angels, and opposed by the dragon and his angels. So this is also a self-contained mini-narrative, number 2. So now we come to read the next story. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "The salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the ruling authority of his Christ have now come, because the accuser of our brothers and sisters, the one who accuses them day and night before our God, has been thrown down. But they overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. Therefore, you heavens, rejoice, and all who reside in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you. He is filled with terrible anger, for he knows that he only has a little time." In this vignette, the senders are God and Christ, who are sending victory to our brothers and sisters. And the brothers and sisters are also the subjects of the story, and they are opposed by the accuser day and night, and they are supported by the blood of the Lamb, by witness, and by love and their own fidelity. So this is a little scene looking forward to final victory, anticipating the end of the whole apocalypse. We come to our final story. Now when the dragon realized that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of a giant eagle, so that she could fly out into the wilderness to the place God prepared for her, where she is taken care of, away from the presence of the serpent, for a time, times, and half a time. Then the serpent spouted water like a river out of his mouth after the woman in an attempt to sweep her away by a flood. But the earth came to her rescue. The ground opened up and swallowed the river that the dragon had spewed from his mouth. So the dragon became enraged at the woman and went away to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony about Jesus. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Another dramatic story here, of course. A time, times, and half a time is really 3.5 times, meaning half of 7. So again, a period limited and under the control of God. This last story can also be analysed using our little pattern. God is bringing safety to the child and to the other children. And the subject of the story again is the woman who herself is given safety. And the woman is opposed by the dragon, by the water spewing from his mouth, and by anger, and is supported by angels' wings, nourishment, and by the earth itself. On 3 slides, I'm going to make some observations about this story sequence. So you see on the chart, I've given the stories letters, story A, B, C, and D. And on the 3rd row, I put the verse numbers. So story A is 1 to 6, story B 7 to 9, story C 10 to 12, and story D 13 to 18. When you analyse the stories, 1 to 6 really tells about the birth of Jesus, or Jesus' history. Story B tells you about the prehistory, so the fall of the angels. And story C tells you about the victory that will come to all who have been faithful, so at the end of history. And story D tells the story of the church's history, the attack on the children of the woman. And the bottom line tells us that story A is within time, history. Story B is before time. Story C is after time. And story D is also within time. If we were to take these 4 stories and put them in correct chronological order, then the order would be story B, story A, story D, and story C. Then we would have the verse numbers 7 to 8, 1 to 6, 13 to 18, and 10 to 12. And then in correct, so to speak, chronological order, we would have the prehistory outside of time, Jesus' history within time, the church's history within time, and the post-history, the victory, which is also outside of time. And once you notice this, the question to ask is, why did the writer jumble the sequence and put the prehistory and the post-history in between Jesus' history and the church's history, which I look at the next slide. So why has our author disturbed the sequence? Our author has disturbed the sequence because he is very keen to show that the battle between good and evil is not resolved or experienced outside of time, nor by escaping time. Rather, that struggle takes place within history. And to achieve this purpose, the writer uses 3 effects. The first is the insertion of the 2 myths of the prehistory and the post-history into an essentially historical sequence, disturbing the proper order of things. The connection between the death of Jesus, the eschatological fulfillment at the end of time, and the present experience of the Christians, and the constant return to earth, which marks each story. So the writer, in some senses, is demythologizing. He's saying the great stories of the struggle, the cosmic struggle between good and evil, is actually experienced within history in the lives of individual Christians. He's also telling them the caliber of their experience. This is not just a difficulty or a pain, but rather the cosmic battle occurring in your life and in your experience. And at the end of each story, the dragon is back on earth to capture the woman thrown down by Michael, vanquished but released for a time, challenging the faithful. A final comment on mythic interpretation, because this text, of course, is full of myth, and myths often have the function of resolving or bringing together things which seem to be totally opposite. For example, you could have a myth which deals with life and death. It could take the concrete form of agriculture and warfare. And then we notice that an intermediate activity resembles both. Hunting is a kind of agriculture, you're getting food to feed yourself. It's also a kind of warfare. So that in the symbolic reading of hunting, it brings together the apparent opposites. And the writer is trying to do something similar in chapter 12 here. At the top of the mythic interpretation is birth or life versus death. And as you can see, under each heading there's a sequence. So birth, pregnancy, believing church, witnessing Christian. And under death, warfare, the persecuting state, and the persecuted Christian. And the element which brings these apparent opposites together is the individual believer, in whom this cosmic struggle is actually taking place at the hands of the persecuting state. And so the witnessing Christian is the persecuted Christian, in whom the battle for good and evil is now taking place. So, what have we just experienced? We have just read an extraordinary and in many ways difficult passage in the Apocalypse. To get under the skin of the reading, we first of all noticed the many biblical allusions, especially to Genesis chapter 3 and the woman. Secondly, by means of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we show that the image of pregnancy, labour pains and childbirth were all part of the apocalyptic imagination of the time. Thirdly, this writer is very much in touch with the culture of the time, in this case with the very similar myth of Leto and Apollo, popular at Patmos as we saw. Fourthly, this very myth was used by the Roman emperors to show that they had brought victory over chaos, order out of disorder, so imperial propaganda. Fifthly, the four stories we noticed are told in what is apparently the wrong order, but on purpose, to show that the cosmic battle takes place not outside of time, but in history and in time. And finally, myth has the power to bring together opposites. The radical opposites of birth and death are combined in the witness of the persecuted Christian, who by means of death is born to new life. Thus, a very powerful and purposeful retelling of many ancient tales. So, what have we learned? We've learned something about the Apocalypse, that the writer is fully aware of the biblical tradition, the current Jewish religious imagination of apocalyptic, the mythologies of ancient Greece and Rome, and the politics of the period. And these powerful references give the text its tremendous resonance at the time, at the same time make it difficult for us, because we're not really in that situation. The second observation we may make is that when people suffer for the faith, it's important to realize the caliber of what's happening. This is not just something awkward or painful, but the cosmic battle of good and evil is actually unfolding in the concrete lives of individual members of the community. Within the text, because of its insistence on victory, there is a deep message of hope. And in many ways, verses 10 to 12 are really a key. This is most likely a piece of liturgy that the community was already singing. And the author wants to teach over and over again that the individual believer finds the resources for faithful resilience within the worshipping community. And it's wonderful that this hymn is prayed today in the Revised Roman Breviary and in many contemporary hymns. And so we close with a prayer. Faithful to your promise, O God, you have lifted up the lowly, clothing with heavenly splendour the woman who bore Christ, our life and resurrection. Grant that the Church, prefigured in Mary, may bear Christ to the world and come to share his triumph. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God, for ever and ever. Amen. Thank you so much for your patience in attending this lecture on the book of Revelation chapter 12. Surely a strange text, but one of course which addresses the common human problem of evil, and also the faith problem. How do we continue to bear witness under pressure? So although a strange reading, it has meaning for us today. So I hope it hasn't all been too much and that you found it useful. Thanks very much.